So it is finally time to quilt the Jelly Roll braid quilts that I made in a video a couple of weeks ago. And if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out because this is, I think, one of my fastest, most favorite quilts I've ever made. So I actually made 2 of them for that video, and today we're going to do the machine quilting on both of them. Now, when I am deciding how to quilt a quilt top, there are a couple of things that I keep in mind. And the first one is kind of the overall feel of the quilt top and what I want the finished product to look like. Now, it just so happens that both of these quilts are destined to be gifted, and so I do want to have them feel similar to each other at the end of this. But this hot pink version definitely gives me some really great 80s vibes. So I want to keep the machine quilting really fun on this one. And I'm thinking that solid pink background is the perfect place for some really great kind of loose graffiti quilting. So that's my plan for the background of that quilt. And the jelly roll kind of section of that quilt, I want to keep pretty simple. I'm going to choose just a couple of designs that I can quilt in those kind of diagonal lines. And then I'm going to do the same designs on the other version, which I made out of Tula Pink Pinkerville. And it has like a much kind of softer, a little bit more feminine feel to it. And those background squares are begging for some really great big bouncy feathers. So I don't get to incorporate feathers a lot, and I think today is the day. I have been debating on how I am going to load these on the long arm. Now, if you're working on a domestic, then you actually have a little bit of an advantage when it comes to maneuvering around a quilt top. Because I'll be working on a long arm, I really only have so much of the quilt exposed to me at one time. So I kind of have a feeling that I'm going to be rolling these quilts back and forth on the long arm and having to break these designs up into a lot of sections. And it's definitely a doable task, but it is one thing that if you do work on a domestic, it is a real advantage that you can quilt a long diagonal section or a vertical section on a quilt and then just take the quilt off of your machine and turn it and go in another direction. So I think all of this will be much clearer when you actually see the quilting. So I did end up loading this quilt kind of sideways. So you can see the arrowhead kind of pointing off to what is the top of the screen, but for me it was the left side of my long arm. To quilt this, I started at the left edge and kind of snuck in through the graffiti to do the pebbles up against the jelly roll slices. And then I filled in the rest of the graffiti quilting to just take up the rest of that space. And then I would sneak back in, and then I would transition to doing all of the jelly roll sections, and I just chose some designs that I knew would touch both sides of the jelly roll strip so that I could transition between the jelly roll strips as I worked from left to right. Now, if I was working on a domestic machine, I would simply do the entire jelly roll strip design from the point of the chevron down to the side of the quilt, and then I wouldn't have to kind of transition between the jelly roll strips like you see me doing here. It is a little bit messier to do that transition. I don't think it's really noticeable in the final quilt, but there are some points where I had to travel along the jelly roll strip or quilt over my lines a little bit because the throat of my machine only allowed me to quilt so much of each jelly roll strip. Once I finally finished all of the jelly roll strips and was into the other side of the background fabric, then it was just the same process that I did in the beginning. I did my little cluster of pebbles and echoed around them and then transitioned right into the graffiti quilting that would get me to the edge of the quilt, which I guess is technically the bottom. This is a very loose style of graffiti. If you like this style, then there are some resources in the description below on where you can learn more about it. When it was time to quilt the second version of this quilt, I loaded this one with the point of the chevron at the kind of top of the working area and ended up quilting large kind of bubbly feathers all over the background fabric of this quilt. And I surrounded it with a simple echo and then just clusters of pebbles to kind of give it some background texture. The quilting of the second quilt did go a lot more smoothly than the quilting of the first quilt because I was just kind of more prepared for dealing with the diagonal jelly roll strips. So I was able to just kind of plan a little bit better our transitions between them. The marking that I did for this quilt was really minimal. I just marked that center spine for my feathers and then quilted along them, and then transitioned right into the pebbles and the jelly roll strips without any marking for either of those. I used the same designs for the jelly roll strips on this quilt as I did for the first quilt, just to give them a little bit of a tie together, because I do want these quilts to be similar but not exactly the same. Now, when it was time to roll the quilt, advance the quilt on the frame, and pick up where I left off, I started in the center of the feathers and just kept going along my line. Now, again, if I was doing this on a domestic, it would have been a lot easier because I wouldn't have had to start and stop the feathers and the designs on the jelly roll strips. So if you quilt on a domestic, then you might have a much easier time with this than I did. Obviously, the long arm is a little bit faster for me, although this footage is sped up, so I don't actually quilt this quickly. But quilting on a domestic definitely has its advantages. So those are our two quilts, and they're all finished. I backed both of these quilts in colors of the Pinkerville wide back from Tula Pink. The pink quilt got the pink version of that backing, and the aqua quilt got the kind of bluish green backing. And I think that it was just another touch to keep these quilts feeling like they belong together. I bound the Pinkerville version in one of the prints from that line, and then I couldn't resist doing hot pink stripes on the hot pink quilt. It doesn't exactly match, but it's more of the fun feel that I was going for. I really enjoy quilting these two quilts, even though those long diagonal jelly roll strips did present a little bit of a complication when I was quilting. I think that the chevron effect really makes for a fun look for a quilt top. So now that these two are done, it is time to move on to my next quilting project. I will be back in the next video with a full quilt tutorial plus quilting ideas. So I think this one is going to be a lot of fun, and it just so happens that I made two quilts for this version as well. So look for that in 2 weeks. And until then, I hope you have an amazing week and happy quilting. I bound them. How did I bind them?